On tonight's show, it's going to be the topic of the International AIDS Conference. And we're having an interview with Asia Russell, who is HealthGap Executive Director, and HealthGap being the AIDS organization founded by a consortium of AIDS activist groups back in 1999, which has struggled mightily to make sure that AIDS drugs could be made generically and given to people with AIDS around the world that wouldn't otherwise be able to afford them. And she'll be describing her experience at the International AIDS Conference that just concluded in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, just last week. Two of the issues that are going to be discussed beyond the tremendous cutbacks by the Trump administration, we'll be hearing about how AIDS activists confronted AIDS coordinator Jeffrey Graham and have cut global AIDS funding by nearly 60%. Additionally, the French ambassador was also confronted because of another 60% slashing of the AIDS budget, which is creating a tremendous shortfall for 1,700 AIDS clinics in the poorest countries of the world. Also, we'll be talking about Gilead and the criticism levied against them for price gouging on a highly effective prevention drug that they charge $28,000 for a year's supply that only cost $40 to manufacture. So we're going to go now to part one of the interview. On January 20th, 2025, President Trump signed an executive order pausing funding for the Presidential Emergency Program for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR for short. That was going against the decision by the Bush administration and subsequent administrations that AIDS was a national security issue. PEPFAR was announced during the first term of George W. Bush at the January 28th, 2003 State of the Union address, where he also announced a planned war on Iraq for imagined weapons of mass destruction. The 2025 pause by the Trump administration caused panic among the agencies, clinics, and health departments in countries hardest hit by AIDS that as they only had enough drugs for a few months that was in stock. While the pause was temporary, full funding was never restored, leading to closure of prevention programs, health centers, and stockouts of AIDS drugs that interrupted the treatment of people with AIDS in many countries, especially in Africa. The organization HealthGap, which was founded in 1998 by Dr. Alan Berkman, ACT UP New York and ACT UP Philadelphia, the Consumer Project on Technology, and many others, had been lobbying for a global fund to fight the HIV/AIDS epidemic and has been protesting and lobbying ever since. HealthGap, Housing Works, and ACT UP have been renewing their efforts since the pause of funding and succeeded in getting it partially restored. Just how much has been restored has been obscured by the Trump administration. However, in June of this year, the State Department had obligated or pledged $2.5 billion less than congressionally mandated by the same time in the funding cycle as the program expended in 2024. The PEPFAR budget is about $4.6 billion, so this is a massive cut to funding for AIDS treatment and prevention. This year, during a pre-conference session at the International AIDS Conference in Rio de Janeiro, HealthGap and other AIDS organizations disrupted the speech of Jeffrey Graham, Trump's U.S. Global AIDS Coordinator, demanding release of the funds. Joining us to discuss this protest and others held at the International AIDS Conference in Brazil is Asia Russell, Executive Director of HealthGap, who's been organizing and protesting at the conference. A point of just disclosure, I'm a member of ACT UP New York, and I was one of the people present at the founding of HealthGap. So joining us to discuss this protest and others at the International AIDS Conference in Brazil is Asia Russell, Executive Director of HealthGap, who's been organizing and protesting at the conference. Asia, can you begin by telling us about what happened at the disruption of the U.S. Global AIDS Coordinator's speech?
Thanks so much for your work and for having me today, John. The US government not only spoke at the conference, they organized what's called a pre-conference, a half-day convening uh, that lays out a detailed agenda around some given topic. And in this case, their focus was their so-called America First Global Health Strategy, a year-old approach to implementing global health funding, taxpayer funding for global health programs that has many failures and many risks, which we'll talk about. So Jeff Graham was speaking as the most senior member leading the US delegation to the International AIDS Conference and opening his own pre-conference. So protesters from Haiti, from South Africa, from the US, from many directly impacted countries and communities gathered in the pre-conference meeting room and interrupted Jeff Graham as he was speaking and marched to the front of the stage, chanting and holding signs. And then we addressed the pre-conference, and our words elicited applause. And many, many people in the audience actually stood up and applauded what we had to say. And our denunciation was clear that the administration's anti-gender, anti-science, illegal attacks on PEPFAR and other global health programs are deadly, that they need to be reversed, that they're in defiance of the separation of powers, that they speak to not just an unspeakably cruel approach of the administration, but they also reflect a deeper constitutional crisis that we're experiencing, one where global health and HIV was actually first in the crosshairs. I think in large part because mistakenly the administration assumed no one would care about it and that it would be an easy house of cards to destroy. In this case, because activism helped create PEPFAR, there's a movement that exists to support it. Not because it's perfect, but because we recognize that it's one of the few things in the global aid architecture that's actually generated impact and results for real directly impacted communities, and we're not going to give up without a fight. So we zapped Jeff Graham um, shortly after he continued speaking. That's when he did such outrageous and really laughably incompetent things as put up a map of Africa that had countries in the wrong places. Imagine rejecting such a grave error at the preeminent scientific conference on HIV and other infectious diseases as the acting global HIV ambassador. What a shame. And what a really pitch perfect reflection of the deep shame that the US government should feel. I mean, I think many of my comrades from around the world were shocked that the US government even dared to open their mouths at such a conference, much less to hold an entire pre-conference, given the long chain, the long tail of clinical harm, the breach of trust, the human rights violations that have come in the wake of the actions of the Trump administration since last January. But it's not all bad news. There are some important signs of progress and some indication that evidence-based advocacy, people power are actually having a positive result even on this intransigent administration.
The New York Times on Monday had a front page spread of priorities regarding global AIDS. In your opinion, how effective has protest and lobbying been in partially restoring the funding? That article details that the part of the funding seems to be going through the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria, which is a multilateral program, in contrast to PEPFAR, uh, that is bilateral and thus has many more strings attached. It's interesting that this has happened. Can you talk about why that is?
I think the role of community organizing and direct action have been absolutely vital in the baby steps forward that we've been able to secure against very tough odds. In fact, progress actually started back in 2025 when activists were able to protect PEPFAR from a direct effort by Russ Vogt, who's the director of the Office of Management and Budget, to do what's called rescind or claw back funding from PEPFAR. He wanted to take away, to steal $400 million of PEPFAR funding. And through a coordinated campaign of community organizing, we pressured people like appropriator Susan Collins, Republican from Maine, the most powerful appropriator in the Senate, to stand up and say no to Russ Vogt and to protect PEPFAR from rescission. And that was ultimately successful. And I just bring that up as one example of why people shouldn't despair, that we can always challenge our directly elected officials and other duty bearers in the face of fascism and tyranny to do what's right, even if they're doing what's right because you're demanding it, not because. And why I say that was a first sign of progress is because what was happening in 2025 was PEPFAR funding was slowing down to a trickle. And if we had lost the rescission battle, then that would essentially supercharge Russ Vogt's effort to further choke out PEPFAR funding. Now, just because we won that didn't mean that all PEPFAR funding fully was restored. PEPFAR money is appropriated on a 5-year time horizon, unlike some other global health programs, which are operated on a 2-year horizon. So that actually sometimes that can mean that spending slowdowns are not attached to funding automatically disappearing, essentially, going away because of the clock running out. So that really can work against us in campaigns like this. But nevertheless, in 2025, we had that positive step forward. However, Vogt was continuing to try to choke out unlawfully any further full obligation of funding. As a result, we continue to pressure senators like Collins, Senator Murray, who's the counterpart ranking senator on appropriations, to stand up straight and demand that the executive abide by the will of Congress and stop defying it. Because in fact, it's the executive that must obey Congress's appropriation. And in the case of PEPFAR, they're doing nothing of the sort. So fast forward to now, indeed, we've continued to see this slow trickle of funding that has huge human implications, which I'll talk about in a second. But now it's not that the floodgates are opening, which is what should be happening. But the tap is getting turned ever so slightly more open. And we won't rest until all of the funding gets restored. And I really can't overstate, however, that all of this was preventable. None of this had to happen. And we're now 16 months into the administration, having moved from deadly stop work orders to essentially 16 months later, slightly more money getting out the door. But PEPFAR, by comparison, not the Global Fund, ignore the Global Fund, PEPFAR on its own is a $4.6 billion a year program. So to say only 2 point something is getting out the door is actually astonishingly bad. We can actually see in PEPFAR's own data that this has had a horrific effect on health service delivery programs across East and Southern Africa and the Caribbean, because PEPFAR's own data show a contraction in HIV diagnosis, through testing in HIV prevention programs like PrEP, which has declined by 42%, and in the rates of new people getting
And
added to the
and
treatment
PrEP
rolls.
and PrEP is the preventive treatment that people can take in order to avoid infection, like if their
So it's
partners.
pre-exposure prophylaxis, which you take typically every day as a pill. So oral PrEP programs and PEPFAR have been the biggest funder of oral PrEP programs across sub-Saharan Africa and most impacted countries around the world. And as a result of the stop work orders and the subsequent policy changes that the Trump administration oversaw, PrEP programs were slashed by 42%. So now, fast forward to today, all of these upheavals never had to happen. Nevertheless, because of shame, pressure, attention, direct action, lobbying, advocacy, global news coverage, uh, uh, dissecting what this administration has done and telling the truth about the harms, we're taking slow steps forward, and we won't rest until those slow steps turn into a run, and we reconstruct PEPFAR so that it's more effective, more accountable than it has been even in the past under the Biden administration.
So, can you talk a little bit about what there were have also been, in addition to PEPFAR's own statistics about um, number of people in treatment or stopping receiving treatment because of the cutback. There are some independent studies as well. Can you talk about those? Because they were a big issue at the conference, right?
Yeah, there were very high profile real world studies about the implications since 2025 of the stop work orders combined with uh, PEPFAR programs implementing the executive orders that came out of the administration, these racist, anti-science, anti-LGBTQ executive orders, which unfortunately many PEPFAR programs implemented to mean that they couldn't actually serve communities who were most in need. So you had these very chilling, reinforcing crises from awards that served LGBTQ communities with HIV treatment and prevention, for example, plus, so awards being canceled outright, plus implementers suddenly being afraid that they couldn't actually follow the science, together creating this wave of uh, increased vulnerability for communities like LGBTQ people, sex workers, people who use drugs, also adolescent girls and young women who are already vulnerable, now having evidence-based, highly effective prevention and treatment programming taken away from them overnight. So what the Rio conference showed was on a large scale the harms to some of these very highly effective and really cutting edge taxpayer funded programming efforts that's going to take so much time to build back. For example, 1,700 treatment programs were closed, at least as a result of these decisions last year. Some implementers reported cuts in condom and lubricant programming, so just delivering commodities like condoms and lube in clinics, in community settings by 93%. Another important, really groundbreaking study, unfortunately, showed that because of these decisions, the cohort of pediatric HIV treatment has shrunk dramatically by 14.3% at least. So that's more than 77,000 kids not being on treatment who should. It's really important to note that pediatric HIV is much more aggressive than HIV in adults because the immune system of any kid is a lot more vulnerable than the immune system of an adult. So unfortunately, 50%, 50, half of all kids that don't have treatment that are HIV positive will be dead by the time of their second birthday. That's how fast HIV can move when it's untreated in a young person. So picture that. These were the first data showing that 77,000 fewer kids are getting treatment because of Donald Trump's outrageous and sadistic decisions than before. So the work ahead to reconstruct this program is huge. It's a public health emergency, but the good news is we have the power of activists in the US and from around the world on our side. And every day the data are piling up about the true real world consequence. And really, we can't act fast enough.
But some of that data is undoubtedly incomplete because when you cut testing programs, then the new positives don't show up in any statistics. Isn't that right?
So all of these data are so conservative in terms of estimating the harm. That's what's so scary. Also, many of these indicators are really lagging indicators. So we can start to see some of the outcomes now, but they're really just the tip of the iceberg. First line treatment across sub-Saharan Africa is with a regimen that has a pretty high threshold for developing what's known as HIV drug resistance. So even a serious disruption, which we know has taken place across East and Southern Africa and West and Central Africa, you'll see some stability in the short term. But how long does that window, provide us? It's not long enough. It's not going to be the duration of the Trump administration. At the same time, an indicator like mortality, so preventable death from HIV, anyone who has HIV can live a long and healthy life with treatment, with care, with protection of their human rights and support. HIV mortality is an indicator that's really difficult to track. And so the State Department can lie all they want and claim that the numbers are fine, but they're hiding. They're sort of using some of the data as a bit of a shell game. But even despite that, the fact that there are harms that are very difficult to detect right now, the fact that PEPFAR itself built many of the data systems that even allow us to track program performance, and they have dismantled many of those systems, so it's hard to count. Even despite all that, the data are an indictment. So that gives you a sense of how chilling the true reality is at the community level. Again, this is not for anyone to feel despair. On the contrary, in the midst of all this, in the midst of an administration that is so, that considers science and human rights anathema, even despite that, we're making some progress. So this might sound depressing, but it's actually a challenge for folks to join these efforts and to help accelerate some of the progress that we're making as quickly as possible, because I believe that we can actually win.
Great. The New York Times on Monday also reported that Secretary of State Rubio, who as senator used to be a supporter of PEPFAR, and now seems to see its loss as endangering U.S. national security interests. And it seems to be related in some way to the Ebola outbreak. Do you agree with that?
I think what we're starting to see is a little bit of additional funding for HIV, for other global health programs, starting to trickle out through the hydraulics of the State Department to the country level. And again, I don't think that's an accident. It's not because Secretary Rubio has had a change of heart, but he recognizes that it is untenable, both from all directions, to permit obstruction of billions and billions of dollars in life-saving health assistance, including for Ebola. for health security, for HIV, to say nothing of humanitarian assistance, water and sanitation, maternal and child health care, all of the other programs that our taxpayer dollars are used to support, that Rubio has been standing in the way of. He recognized he can't do it forever, no matter what he wants to do, and that's the reality that's bearing down on him. Of course, it might feel, I think, to many of us, too little, too late, and also it's not fast enough. Again, let's remember we're still at markedly less PEPFAR funding flowing through the system than this time in ordinary times. So orders of magnitude less. So they must step on the gas. They have to, and that's what we'll continue to focus on.
So the US has not been the only one to cut global AIDS funding. Donor funding globally, according to the Times article, has declined by 25%. And even France has slashed its share by 60%. Did Health Gap or ACT UP protest this as well at the conference?
Yes, we did. I mean, indeed, there's been an unprecedented decline in funding, but that has I can't overstate how much that's been led by the US. And again, the extraordinary thing here is there hasn't been a decline in appropriated HIV funding. The money's there. The decline has been in money actually being programmed to save lives, which is just unspeakably cruel. Now, the US action seems to have disinhibited European donors, which is appalling. And the French government under Emmanuel Macron indeed cut its contribution to the Global Fund by an unprecedented amount of about €1 billion. So that's a almost 60% reduction in their funding level. So we decided to protest the global health ambassador to France, Anne-Claire Ampreux, who had the nerve to show up at this conference when she was launching the French government's commercial booth in Rio. So activists from Tanzania, from Haiti, from South Africa, from Germany, from the US, from Uganda participated in a very loud and well-covered disruption of her speech. We marched to the booth, which was surrounded by people the French government had invited from the scientific community, from the political community, from the media, and we chanted, "You have blood on your hands, funding cuts kill," because it's absolutely true. She's responsible, and the contraction of the Global Fund's available resources will directly set back life-saving prevention and treatment, in particular for some of the areas where the Trump administration has been the cruelest. So for gender-based violence prevention, for prevention efforts to target queer groups, sex workers, people who use drugs, for investments in community-based programming that's so critical to mobilize demand for prevention and treatment services. The Global Fund hasn't cut those efforts, but the French government pulling the rug out from under its own response means those priority programming efforts will be on the chopping block first. So we want that decision to be reversed. We think there's still a way back for the French government to show leadership and to embrace science and to be held accountable. But in the meantime, we have to challenge political leaders like Ampreux wherever they are.
Great. So these weren't the only issues at the AIDS conference. Brazil has been angry that lenacapavir, which is a long-acting HIV prevention drug that was tested on Brazilians, is not going to be affordable for Brazilians once it's approved. And this drug, only 2 shots a year are needed to protect an individual from an HIV infection. And the company that manufactures it, Gilead, is charging US $29,000 for a year's supply, and when it only costs $40 to manufacture. So, can you talk about um, the activist response to this? Was Gilead called on the carpet?
Gilead was challenged through protest, through the interventions by scientists and activists from the podium, during abstracts and during plenary sessions multiple times. It's important to note that Gilead's the biggest funder of the International AIDS Conference too. So their promotion was also everywhere throughout all of the material and the physical representation of the conference in the Rio Centro, which was the massive conference structure where Rio 2026 was taking place. So indeed, the countries where HIV is actually growing fastest are across Latin America and the Caribbean in criminalized and marginalized populations who, in particular, haven't been able to use oral PrEP um, in uh, in a way that makes it effective for them as a prevention intervention. So it's a public health emergency to make sure superior prevention interventions like lenacapavir get to trans, queer, sex working, gender diverse communities as quickly as possible. And Gilead's strategy has been exactly the opposite. Instead of a robust access program that would allow for generic competition through voluntary licensing, for example, that reaches Brazil and other Latin American countries, Gilead has made its intention clear. It wants to do what's called tiered pricing, which essentially means charging as much as they think the market will bear in a country like Brazil. So they can profiteer off of wealthier people, even if it means the pandemic is prolonged. Lenacapavir is a potentially game-changing intervention because it is virtually 100% effective. The convenience of being able to get a long-acting intervention without anyone knowing that you've done it is incredibly important for people for whom oral PrEP just simply is not conducive to them as an effective mechanism. So it's really important to stress that Gilead's standing in the way and denying widespread access to this intervention is deeply troubling, deeply outrageous. And one thing we need is for the Brazilian government to break Gilead's monopoly and get generic lenacapavir into the country as quickly as possible. So there were actually protests challenging Gilead, multiple protests. And at the same time, activists went to the Brazilian Ministry of Health's booth and demanded that Brazil break its patents, break the patents that have been granted to Gilead for lenacapavir as good public health policy. So we need, to keep pressuring governments in Latin America to put public health ahead of intellectual property rights. But it is truly a bittersweet moment in prevention where tools like lenacapavir have been brought to market because of the brave participation of communities across East and Southern Africa, across Latin America, and in the United States, put their bodies on the line in the interest of science. And now the benefit of that science is not being given to them. I would also say, even in the countries Gilead says it's prioritizing, so it's 126 countries, mainly in East and Southern Africa, that are covered by a voluntary licensing scheme where Gilead will permit a handful of drug manufacturers to make a generic version. Even for those countries, right now, they're getting very, very few doses. So there are clinics in Uganda, in Malawi, in Zambia that are starting to provide lenacapavir, but it's a joke. They're getting only handfuls of doses. So I know of a clinic in Uganda that literally got 26 doses. This is for 26 people. And the interest and the enthusiasm, the desire is so high. Now remember, Uganda is a country that already participated in implement in the pivotal phase 3 clinical trials that helped Gilead get US FDA approval that will basically be its shot toward making billions off this drug. So they were already well aware of this product, very excited, very enthusiastic. Imagine how crestfallen, how upset to already be seeing stockouts of such an important intervention. But that's where we are, and that's purely Gilead's making. So we're intensifying our efforts with Brazilian colleagues, colleagues from Argentina, from Mexico, from across Latin America and the Caribbean, to try to challenge governments to stand up, uh, uh, break Gilead's monopoly and bring the price tumbling down through generic competition as quickly as possible.
So, and MSF, they have been complaining that they can't get the drug. Why is that? Do you know?
So another part of Gilead's strategy is much like we were talking about Russ Vogt choking out the disbursement of funding for treatment and prevention. Gilead, ironically, is creating its own chokeholds on volumes of lenacapavir earmarked for low and middle income countries. That's because they're not interested in making the drug available at a lower price in those markets. So the way they're doing that is by requiring all of that product to flow only through the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. MSF just wants to buy the drug directly, like many ministries of health just want to buy the drug directly from Gilead. And it's so counterintuitive. Gilead's basically saying, no, you are only allowed access to this limited number of doses that we've set aside for the Global Fund. But in the end, it makes sense. They're creating artificial scarcity because they want to maximize the number of doses. There isn't any actual shortage of lenacapavir. They have plenty. They just want to maximize the number of doses that are for high income countries and keep the number right now, before generics come on the market, that are set aside for poorer countries as limited as possible. Why? Because those are doses that are made available at a lower price. So every dose that they can make sure doesn't get to a poor country is a dose that they can charge $28,000 per year for. So it makes perfect sense that they would tell the MSF or other humanitarian organizations or other governments that they must compete essentially for the same limited denominator of doses for 2 million people. It's truly insane, and it speaks to what's really broken with the way our medicines, uh, our drug development system works. And we need to push Gilead to make more doses available right now, to stop enforcing its intellectual property rights. I mean, it's really important to emphasize this is a prevention option that is unlike the other options in the toolbox for HIV prevention. It's not like for a person who is at risk of HIV infection, they can just use oral PrEP. Because again, what the data show is that if someone isn't in a position where they're able to take a pill every day, and that happens for lots of different reasons to lots of different people, it's not like they're then going to start because they can't get lenacapavir. They won't be protected from HIV. So the option is either affordable, accessible lenacapavir or potential avoidable acquisition of HIV. And it's Gilead that's really standing in the way. So that was the site of a lot of criticism, not just from activists, but also from governments, from UN family organizations. The WHO spoke out about it, so did UNAIDS, so did many others. But Gilead isn't budging. They came completely empty handed. They had no new announcements in Rio. So we need to continue to hold them accountable.
So another thing that caught my eye was RFK's role in terms of, uh, PEPFAR funding um, and also even funding of AIDS in the United States. Can you talk about his role?
Unfortunately, RFK has done grave harm alongside the State Department to HHS's domestic and global HIV efforts. That includes program support, but also research, um, uh, all aspects of the scientific agenda around HIV, from developing and investing in the pipeline of scientists um, from university, right to mentorship, and then to leading in their own fields. Because from day one of the administration, there's been firings, there has been award cancellations for research, there's been the dismantling of programs that invest in the next generation of scientists, and that hasn't been meted out equally. It's really been focused on those programs that are about addressing inequities fueled by social injustice, like racism, like sexism, like uh, transphobia, homophobia. So, of course, that intersects with HIV. So that's drawn the ire and the attraction of people like RFK. So that's one dimension. I think the other dimension is RFK is a known AIDS denialist. He has unending antipathy toward the work of folks like Tony Fauci, folks who have been really leading in the infectious disease uh, response for generations. Um, and we see that from across, what his administration has done. Um, the multi-generational harms to science, to service delivery, um, are really going to have to be a priority of the next Congress and the next administration. And we need to really push for that. I mean, one of the things that's happening right now is like new waves of attacks on Ryan White. So you can think right down to the very local level that's administered through something called HRSA within HHS. I mean, you'd be hard pressed to find any dimension of the HIV response, which activists have really fought to build over the last 40 years, that has been untouched by RFK. And that's not been by accident. I think he has a lot of people advising him as well, who see this as a core part of their anti-science, anti-gender agenda, and it's terrifying. And we need to keep calling it out, particularly since RFK is really more and more of a liability for politicians, considering how gravely unpopular his deadly anti-vaccine agenda is, if not the other elements that I've described. But it's also really important to recognize that even in as much as RFK has focused on HIV researchers, HIV programs, that actually harms everybody, because HIV science it's been, these are fields that touch on immunology, on virology, on so many efforts that help make everybody healthier and help make science stronger in so many ways. So even for those who are less focused on HIV, um, the concern is how it touches on cancer, on pediatrics, on social science and studies of inequities, and the social determinants of health. Just as HIV has helped like lift up science in so many ways over the last many decades, the kind of cuts and cruelties that RFK is carrying out is unfortunately affecting far beyond HIV alone.
Well, that's great. So in closing, um, what do you suggest people who are concerned about AIDS globally should be, what are their options for helping to contribute to the fight?
Well, I think the good news is everyone has the chance to be part of efforts to reconstruct and repair these programs. and we don't have to wait for the next administration. We, by going to the Health Gap website, that's healthgap.org, you can get on our mailing list and get engaged with simple ways to take action. You don't have to do civil disobedience if you're not comfortable with that. Honestly, we're constantly calling members of Congress, calling other duty bearers, and it's getting results. I mean, you see just yesterday, actually, because of all the pressure against Russ Vote's effort to politicize the process of federal grant making, which again would have a huge effect on the HIV response, because it would basically mean if you're not doing the science that Russ Vote wants you to do, you won't get funding. That federal rule effort generated backlash from activists like us and from the scientific community, more than 500,000 negative comments. And as a result, this Congress, this extreme Congress, is actually passing a measure in its spending bill that requires that rulemaking effort to be paused. So that's a huge success. That's just a small indication of what people can be a part of. So if you feel despair because of everything you're seeing around you, ironically, getting involved in AIDS activism is a way to help remind yourself of your own power, to bring your own skills to a frontline effort that's focused on saving lives, but also on challenging the next generation of leaders in Congress and in the White House to put global HIV right at the forefront of its political platform. Because that won't happen on its own either. We know that. We didn't see very many mainstream Democrats coming to the defense of PEPFAR in the first days of the Trump administration. So we really can't take Reconstruction for granted either.
Wow. Well, this has been a very interesting exposition of what happened at the International AIDS Conference. I wish I could have been there to see the look on Jeff Graham's face, and also the French ambassador, her face. So anyway, thank you very much for joining us, Asia Russell, Executive Director of Health Gap. And we'll provide the website on our website. And any photos that you want to share, we'd like to put them up.
Will
Maybe
do.
everyone can see the look on Mr. Graham's face.
Absolutely. Thank you, John. It's been a joy to talk to you.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Thank you.
So we can end this and then just stop recording.